The committee will come to order. Today, our committee will consider a resolution of inquiry offered by Mr. Pascrell that's related to President Trump's confidential tax and financial information. To be frank, this measure is a procedural tool being utilized, and I believe abused, for obvious political purposes. I said back in March when a similar resolution was offered, it does absolutely nothing to solve real challenges facing people, families, and job creators in our communities. With this resolution, minorities seeking to have the Treasury Department collect 10 years of President Trump's individual tax returns, then turn that information over to Congress. In addition, it calls for the mass collection of similar information from over 500 business entities. To my knowledge, no single individual has ever been targeted by this committee in such a manner. In fact, the scope of this request is nearly unprecedented in the history of our committee. On a select few occasions, Ways and Means has sought tax return information as part of our responsibility to oversee the administration of our nation's tax code. But never has our committee used its authority to single out and rummage through the confidential taxpayer information of one person without their consent, not to mention over 500 different business entities. To top it all off, there's just no mechanism through which the Treasury Secretary could legally comply with the request as written. Beyond the obvious shortcomings of this request and its clear political nature, this resolution would be a blatant invasion of privacy. I hope every member of our committee, no matter what side of the dais you sit on, recognizes the dangerous precedent that would be set here. If this power can be abused to single out President Trump for political purposes, what prevents Congress from doing the same to other Americans and abusing the rights of other hardworking families? Civil liberties and privacy are rights that demand the utmost protection, and I intend to protect them. I will oppose this resolution, and I urge all members of our committee to do the same. With that, I'll yield to Ranking Member Neal for any opening statement he may have. Mr. Neal?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to make a few short comments, and then I'll yield the remainder of my time to our colleague, Mr. Pascrell, to make an opening statement as well on his resolution. Mr. Pascrell's resolution would direct the Treasury Secretary to provide the House with the personal and business tax returns and other financial information of President Trump. Let me refresh everyone's memories on the facts here. Until recently, every president since Gerald Ford released their tax returns to the American public. President Ford released a summary of his tax returns as well. President Carter, President Reagan, President H.W. Bush, President Clinton, President George W. Bush, and President Barack Obama would be included. Republican and Democratic presidents all released their tax returns to the American people. This is not a partisan issue, and the reason for releasing this information is to avoid conflicts of interest. Tax returns include important information about income, charitable giving, business interests, among other things. The information is important to the American people so that they know that their president is always acting in their best interest. I support Mr. Pascrell's resolution, and I believe it's in the country's best interest for our presidents to release their returns. And with that, I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Pascrell.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Neal. You've yielded to Mr. Pascrell? Yes. Mr. Pascrell, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's see if we're rummaging. I like that word. I want to begin by thanking my colleagues for being here this afternoon. The chairman of the Committee on Ways and Means has the authority to request President Trump's tax returns to be reviewed in a closed session. Authority founded in Section 6103 of the Internal Revenue Code. That change was made in 1924 because of the greatest scandal of the 20th century and because the Secretary of the Interior, Mr. Fall, was taking on a profit in the selling of the Naval Reserve's oil. Read it very carefully because we are about to go into Chapter 2 there, now that the Interior Secretary and the President are recommending that we sell off public lands for private development. Now, I've had repeated requests to this chairman to make this request today. The Republicans on the committee continue to be complicit in keeping the president's tax returns hidden. I hope you read the front page of the U.S. Today. If you read it today. This resolution will force the committee to vote, give our colleagues another opportunity to fulfill the responsibility to the American people. The President and the Republicans in Congress have proposed pursuing comprehensive tax reform that lowers rates for businesses and simplifies the tax code. We don't have the details of the proposal yet. And we also don't know how the President stands to benefit from the various tax reform. That was a sophomore question maybe back in January. It is no longer a sophomore question. They're supposedly under consideration right now. And it's undeniable. As the committee that has jurisdiction over the tax code, it is our responsibility to have a public conversation about tax reform policies and who they benefit. So far, the tax reform discussions have happened behind closed doors, being cut between, I imagine, Republican leadership and the White House. In fact, Mr. Chairman, I was disappointed that you scheduled this meeting today at the same time as the Democratic caucus was to hold a public forum on tax reform, forcing it to be postponed. We should be debating these issues before the public. Pushing out of a public forum only pushes tax reform discussions further in the dark. We know, based on two-page release of a 2005 tax return, that President Trump would personally benefit by $31 million from changes that the Republicans have proposed in their blueprint when you eliminate the alternative minimum tax. Under the plan laid out so far, the president's income tax would be lower than the average rate paid by families earning $75,000. It is important that we guarantee that wealthy individuals pay their fair share in taxes, like everybody. It is disturbing that Mr. Trump is pushing tax changes that benefit himself by tens of millions of dollars a year. The old return that we do have shows that President Trump is pushing for tax changes that benefit multimillionaires like himself and not the middle class. His full, up-to-date tax returns would also show us how honest he was in paying his taxes, how aggressively he avoided those taxes, and whether he used dubious legal measures as has been reported, and whether he has been audited correctly by the IRS. This resolution, Mr. Chairman, asks for information pertaining to not only Mr. Trump's personal tax return, president's returns, but the returns of the companies from which he owns, controls, profits from as listed in his FEC disclosure form 278.
Mr. Pascrell, I apologize. We are more than a minute and a half over, and perhaps we can have a member yield at a future point. I want to make sure you can finish your statement.
Thank you.
No, thank you, sir. So the committee will now proceed to consideration of House Resolution 479 without objection. The measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Mr. Pascrell, you're recognized.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Trump has not divested from his businesses, as was recommended by the Office of Government Ethics. Mr. Trump runs enterprises through more than 500 LLCs, and each of those has operational income and expenses, and those pass-throughs will pass through those incomes and expenses into President Trump's 1040. As we examine the conflicts of interest, it makes sense to examine the tax information of those businesses to see where conflicts may arise. Now, let me just go very briefly, Mr. Chairman, since I've been schooled and preached to here in past situations about what tax forms are all about. You would see investments, the rebuttal is, you're not going to see the president's foreign investments or debts owed in his tax returns. That was here stated. Well, you would see investments in a few places if you have Schedule D, which shows a gain or loss of a foreign asset, or if he filed what we call an FBAR, part of the Financial Crimes Unit to prevent money laundering, or more recently requirements under the FACTA Act, like an 8938 form, which requires disclosure of foreign accounts. You're not going to see it in the document that was made public. In fact, that's one page of the 12,000 pages that we need to look at. These identify foreign account ownership or signature. If he had a personal foreign account or a signature authority on a foreign account or foreign mutual funds, we've been able to see that. I've heard someone claim here that 515 businesses returns, this is a fishing expedition. Mr. Trump has not divested from his businesses as was recommended by the Office of Government Ethics. President Trump runs enterprises through more than 500 LLCs, and each of those has operational income, expenses, and those pass-throughs will pass through those incomes and expenses into Mr. Trump's 1040. So I'm ready to debate the tax issues, I can assure you. News reports suggest that the former FBI Director Robert Mueller, who's leading the investigation into the president's campaign's ties to Russia, is enlisting the IRS Criminal Investigations Unit. It will be embarrassing for this committee if those not in the legislative branch do their homework and we do not, when we've had 12 opportunities to do it. So why is he enlisting the IRS Criminal Investigation? Well, we started off February the 1st. You're not going to find out much about what his investments are, what his debt is, what his borrowing, unless you have his tax returns. So, that unit, which I just referred to, Mr. Chairman, specializes in tax-related and money laundering crimes, and that he has accessed President Trump's tax returns. We'll be behind the curve. Aren't we going to look foolish when this all comes out later, whatever comes out, even an exoneration, when we did not fulfill our responsibilities? Our responsibilities. Where is the legislative branch of government? What are we waiting for? The investigative committees would love to have the president's tax returns. Mr. Mueller would love to have the president's tax returns. It's reported that Paul Manafort, the former Trump campaign manager, is being investigated as well for possibly not checking the box on his tax returns to claim a foreign bank account. 1040 forms even have a box on Schedule B.
Mr. Pascrell,
I'm in the middle of a sentence.
I'm making this a habit today, but all time has expired, and we'll be sure to recognize other of your colleagues to allow you to finish that statement. With that, and before I turn to Mr. Renacci, one point I failed to make at the beginning of this markup is, as you know, we've watched Hurricane Harvey just drop unprecedented amounts of rain and damage throughout Texas, Louisiana, and other states. I've never, frankly, seen anything like it in my district. And while we're very proud of how our neighbors are helping neighbors in Texas, and we have Democrat and Republican leaders working alongside in a beautiful way, the truth is, boy, every state in America has sent us help. We've seen volunteers and food from every state, volunteers, rescuers, boats, people volunteering in shelters, food, medical supplies, from every state, it seems like, around the country. And while we're proud of our neighbors helping each other, we are so grateful to America that you've helped us through this very difficult time. I should have begun that hearing with that sentiment. To all the members, to your constituents, America, thank you so much. Yeah, Mr. Neal.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we all want you to know that across the country, the national principle is at stake. Coming to the aid of members of the American family is the priority here. And earlier today, I met with representatives of the Virgin Islands. And I believe that our friends in Florida are going to be experiencing similar damage. So I hope, based on the conversation that you and I had yesterday, that the committee here is prepared to offer some tax relief to those families that have found themselves in this horrific predicament.
Yes, sir. So. Yeah, and I am very worried about Irma and the damage it will do. So let's work together as a committee to make sure we can help those folks. Mr. Nacy, you recognize strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And while I have a great deal of respect for Mr. Pascrell, I'm beyond skeptical of this resolution before us today. Not only does this strike me as a fishing expedition, but it's reminiscent of the egregious behavior we saw from the Obama administration and the IRS in unfairly targeting select political groups and individuals for not disclosing anything remotely close to the caliber of all the supplemental materials requested under this resolution. It's indisputable that President Trump's tax return would be one of the most complicated of any president in history. As a CPA and tax practitioner, I've both worked on audits and personally prepared some of the most complicated tax returns imaginable. I can't envision a scenario where a tax practitioner would advise their client to let an incredibly complicated tax return go through the media's version of an audit while a real audit was underway. No one in this room would ever want to be in such an unfair position. This is not about transparency and openness. This is about overreach and political motivation. I've listened, as I said, to my friend Mr. Pascrell read off statements and different forms, but I still question if he could even take one of those forms and explain to me what he would be looking for, and even if he found it, what it would be meant to him or any one of his colleagues on the other side. Because many of these forms, again, will not get him the fishing expedition information that he's looking for. Yes, it will show transactions, legal transactions. Yes, it will show information, legal information. Yes, it will show things that are under audit and have been audited by the IRS, which if they were illegal or improper, the IRS would make note of them. Yet what we want to do is make note of them publicly just for a political reason. Again, this is not...
Chairman, a point of order.
Again, this is not...
Mr. Chairman, no one on this panel has ever stated to make anything public. I don't know what you're talking about.
Mr. Pascrell, we will make sure that you have an opportunity to respond through your comments.
Well, I need to correct the record.
The regular order. So, Mr. Nacy, you have the time.
Thank you. This is not about transparent openness. As I said, this is about overreach and political motivation. I urge my colleagues to vote to report this resolution unfavorably and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Nacy. Mr. Levin, you're recognized.
Just quickly, there's been reference to the IRS. Someday there'll be an investigation as to the abuses of 501c4s by many organizations in this country. I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Pasquale.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, when Mr. Mueller is doing his job, we need to do ours. And I would ask to the last speaker, who I consider my friend, unless he changed his mind this morning, how do you know what you're talking about? Is Mr. Mueller on a fishing expedition? Are the investigative committees on fishing expeditions? Are they? Say so, if that's what you believe. Because all we're asking is for a review, which is under the auspices of law. We're not making up the law. This is the law that gives us the power. The Finance Committee, Senate Finance Committee, the power, and the Joint Committee on Taxation. This is not a fishing expedition. We are not rummaging through private stuff, and no one on this committee has suggested that we make public whatever we find. No one. Tax reform should not be another opportunity for this president to get some goodies for his friends and family at the expense of the taxpayers. And I would say we must not be part of any potential corruption in any form that exists. This is our responsibility. And let me tell you something. If I was sitting on a document that could prove my innocence and that all of us have been wrong, wouldn't you want to present that document and say, look, here it is, it's over? What in God's name is he hiding? Every president since Gerald Ford has done this. Why wouldn't we do our due diligence? And why wouldn't we examine his tax returns for possible conflicts of interest and potential criminal wrongdoing? Why are the Republicans being complicit in keeping his tax returns hidden? What are you hiding? I want to know what you're hiding. I know most of you. I don't believe you're hiding anything, but you got to step up to the plate. I haven't accused anybody here of anything. You're accusing me of going on a witch hunt. I mean, that's what you started to say back in February. I mean, you ought to get a new line, Mr. Chairman. A new line is needed. I am not going to yield, Mr. Chairman, I'm telling you, on this issue. And as I said from the very beginning, this is not doing it to embarrass anybody. I asked you, Mr. Chairman, to be part of this investigation from the very beginning, and the first letter I sent you on February the 1st. That's why I wanted to do this. No, we're rummaging through the private things of people. We're not just talking about a person. We're talking about the person who is the President of the United States. We want to know what ours. He has to deal with foreign countries day in and day out. I want a president that's in position. No president has been perfect, Mr. Chairman. I know that. But I don't want to have a president representing me who maybe has conflicts in his so many endeavors and so many investments. That's what I want to have. While the president left his business endeavors in the hands of his sons when he became president, we know that Mr. Trump Jr. was deeply involved in the campaign, and that President Trump wrote the statement Don Jr. gave following disclosure of his meeting with a Russian representative during the 2016 presidential campaign. Look, are we really to believe there are no entanglements between the personal and the political, or that his son never discusses business with his father? That would be ridiculous to say. You don't believe that, and I don't believe that. We have reason to look into his business activity. Just a few weeks ago, the New Yorker reported that a 2011 Trump deal in the Republic of Georgia very likely involved bank fraud and money laundering by a Kazakh oligarch who has direct links to Russian President Vladimir Putin. His head rears. His head comes up every discussion we go into about this. This follows earlier reports that the president helped build a hotel in Azerbaijan that appears to be a corrupt operation by oligarchs tied to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard.
All time has expired. Mr. Doggett, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This hearing is totally unnecessary. The committee should have acted on February 1st, shortly after receiving Mr. Pascrell's letter, or when I offered the First Amendment in the committee for disclosure, or when the first motion was made on the floor of the House, or when we have come back again and again seeking disclosure pursuant to existing law that would involve private examination of these returns by committee staff and by the members, and then possibly disclosure after that, depending upon what's found. And to anyone who says that we sound like a broken record, there is a broken record here, and it is that of Donald J. Trump. Unlike prior presidents, he has refused to disclose his tax returns. He's not the first wealthy business person to seek office. Look back only to Mitt Romney and recognize that he followed the precedents of other presidential candidates in releasing fully his tax returns. That's what should have happened here, so that today we could focus on the so-called Republican tax reform plan, which has had very little attention in this committee, and which we could take a look and see whether there's any reform in the tax reform, or this is just borrowing more money from abroad to provide tax breaks to whoever has the strongest lobbying force here, which has been the pattern in the past at great expense to our country. Really today is a choice about whether there'll be continued complicity in the ongoing cover-up of the Trump tax returns, or whether we will look under that rock and determine exactly what is there. And you know, the price of these tax breaks that are being proposed is a high one. Those that think that Mr. Trump represents the golden ticket to get giant tax breaks seem to be silent in the face of just one bit of error on Mr. Trump's part after another. Tolerating his collusion, certainly his attempts at collusion with the Russians, his dangerous bumbling, his embrace even this past month of torchlit processions that he described as very fine people, they're moot in the face of Trump's conduct in hopes that he and only he can deliver huge tax breaks. Almost every day, Mr. Trump sullies the high office that he holds and endangers our values and our families. He has bragged about being able to bend the tax code to his whim. He said that only he can fix the tax code. And the question remains, will he fix it for himself and the 500 entities that he reflects in his disclosure, or will it be fixed to help working families? Before this committee considers a dime worth of tax breaks for those at the top, the American people have a right to know whether the Trump tax plan is just about Trump, which is what everything that Mr. Trump talks about seems to address, whether it's about self-enrichment for him and his family, or whether it is enriching America as a whole. We need to lift the cover-up of these Trump's tax returns and accompany any tax plan that is proposed with a line-by-line report of how much Mr. Trump, his family, and his companies will benefit. There's a direct interest of this committee and the work that we're doing on taxes in what is hidden in the Trump tax returns, and that's why it's so important to get to it. We've only seen, of course, one page so far from the Trump administration on that tax return, but included in that is the move to pass through businesses to lower their returns. And Mr. Trump appears to have about 500 pass-through businesses. There's an attempt to eliminate the alternative minimum tax, which we know from 1 year of 2 pages of Trump tax returns would have given him a rate of 3.48%, less than an employee contributes on their Social Security. These are significant tax issues in addition to the day-by-day drip, drip, drip of more evidence of Russian entanglement through his businesses. We need to get to the bottom of this, and this committee is one that is unique in being vested with legislative authority and long-standing precedent for being able to do just that. So I commend Mr. Pascrell, encourage the support of his resolution. If not today, it's just a question of how long the cover-up and the concealment goes on, because eventually this will become available for the American people. I yield back.
Thank you. So let me just provide a friendly reminder that we should not engage in personalities in this debate. Just as a reminder, House Rule 17 governs decorum debate. by requiring that remarks be confined to the question under debate, avoiding personalities. So in order to avoid engaging in personalities, members of both parties should not make derogatory statements about another member, senator, or the president. This includes calling into question motives or character. And so I would ask, as we discuss and debate this issue, that we may remain well within the guardrails of that House rule. Mr. Kelly, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. It wasn't too long ago that there was an inquiry, and I think Mr. Doggett made reference to Governor Romney when he was running for president. I do recall very, very accurately a statement that was made by the then majority leader in the Senate that this man doesn't pay any taxes. When his taxes were revealed, and it was said, well, wait a minute, you said he never paid any taxes. That was a false statement. The Senate majority's leader answer was, well, he didn't win, did he? And so then the question becomes, what are we really looking for? Because the fact of the matter is that the IRS has every single one of our tax returns. These aren't things that are hidden away in some vault that nobody gets a chance to look at. Believe me. The question is, should they be made public? And the answer is this IRS already has the ability to look into every single return that any of us make, including the current President of the United States. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield my time to Mr. Renacci.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. You know, it's interesting as you read this resolution. In this resolution before the committee today, the request is for any related supplemental information, and that could arguably include accountants' working papers and other information that goes far beyond what other presidents have chosen to disclose. Perhaps that's the reason, Mr. Pascrell, maybe we're finally recognizing that the tax returns really won't tell us much, that we would add that line. That is an overreaching and overburdening request that I think is, again, extends far beyond what you're trying to find here. I want to throw some words out that I heard from my friend, and I do call him my friend, Mr. Pascrell. I heard that we need to investigate corruption. I heard that we need to investigate money laundering. I heard that we need to investigate criminal intent. I heard him say that we need to investigate bank fraud. I heard him say that we need to, and this might have been for Mr. Doggett, we need to look at he's bending the tax code, self-enrichment, pass-through businesses. None of this is going to come out by grabbing his tax returns. I've been in the tax world for 30 years. And by the way, if the IRS is auditing these things, and you really believe that they're not as good as we are, that the IRS wouldn't, if you believe that by finding these documents that you're going to find corruption, money laundering, criminal intent, bank fraud, that he's bending the tax code, that he's self-enriching himself, that he's passing through businesses. By the way, the IRS is already auditing all this stuff. So now you're saying, well, we don't think the IRS is doing a good enough job because we think that, and by the way, I think if the IRS found some of the stuff you're talking about, corruption, money laundering, criminal intent, bank fraud, that they'd be turning his tax returns over to a different authority. This makes no sense. I mean, you want to bring all this to the committee. You want to have staff and committee look at all this when the IRS is already looking at it, and you believe that this committee is better equipped than the Internal Revenue Service. I would have to tell you that these returns are under investigation, under review, and under audit, and if these things were found or seen, and if it's that easy to find them, and you think our committee is going to find them and our staff's going to find them, then clearly the IRS would find them. He's under an IRS audit. I think we need to let the IRS audit continue, if that's what you're worried about, and let them disclose whether they find these things. But again, I would hope that we recognize that we're not going to find what we're trying to find. And again, as I've said, my friend Mr. Pascrell, I truly believe this is a phishing investigation, a political investigation, and again, I hope that my colleagues vote to report this resolution unfavorably. And again, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. You recognize. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with whomever noted that this is really unnecessary. and it could have been avoided completely had the president done what he promised to do, and that was to make public his tax returns. He went back on his word. He said he would do it, and then he went back on his word. I also believe that it's important for our constituents. They deserve to know where the president's personal financial interests end and where America's interests begin. And this is even more important today, given the fact that we're supposed to be endeavoring to do tax reform. And if you look at some of the proposals that have been put out by my friends on the majority side of the aisle and the president himself, it does need to be looked at to clear this up, because I don't want my constituents paying for a pass-through reduction on the hundreds of businesses that the president owns. I don't want my constituents to see a tax increase at the expense of the alternative minimum tax, which has been pointed out the only tax that we know for sure that the president is paying. And I don't want my constituents to be paying for an estate tax measure. And believe me, I think everybody here knows, and you've heard ad nauseum, that I think we need to reform the estate tax, especially as it pertains to small businesses and family-owned farms. But instead, we're deflecting to some effort that doesn't provide help for the family farmers and the businesses in order to gain political favor. But I don't want my constituents to pay for billions of dollars in tax cuts to the president's advisors and family. I think this is very pertinent information to know, and I think we should use the authority that has been given to this committee to find answers to these questions. And I want to yield my remaining time to my colleague, Mr. Pascrell.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Chairman, one administration source called it a vending machine mentality and said it had to be made clear that, quote, the government is not a vending machine, that it's not here to profit the president's friends. Not everybody in this administration necessarily sees it that way, unquote. That's a quote. The United States government isn't a vending machine. It isn't a kleptocracy. At least not if we do our job and provide a check on the executive branch by overseeing this president's conflicts of interest. And by the way, the president may be able to scare us, but he ain't scaring the 19 states that are bringing suit on this very issue. And the state of New York is not going to be stopped by the executive branch of the federal government. Very important to understand that, and I would advise everybody in this room to read what they've come up with so far. The president can't stop a state investigation. So, I want to know one false statement I've made since February the 1st, since that was accusatory. You know, when we're praising the IRS, and that's a good sign, we must be doing something right, I guess. This has been a different story for the time that I've been on the Ways and Means Committee. What we need to explore are the possibilities of conflicts of interest. This is not something we made up. This is provided by the law. Now, it's a fishing expedition. Why? Because we don't have the conclusion? Well, you don't get to the conclusion unless you're allowed to investigate. We have that authority under the law. And if you looked at the word under IRS audit, I want you to prove to me that he's still under audit. I got 13 seconds left. I'll listen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back for now.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. You're recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strike the last word, and First, let me associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Neal, and certainly to you, Mr. Chairman, and everything that the people of Texas have endured and that we anticipate people in Florida will be facing as well. And let us remember in this committee that at the end of the day, as Mr. Neal noted, with the effects of Irma already on the Caribbean and what we foresee will be greater danger to Florida yet, that we all need to pull together. My good friend and colleague often talks about Teapot Dome, and I don't think that it's Teapot Dome historically that comes into play here. I do think, however, that another son of Italian immigrants named Ferdinand Pecora played a very important role in history. Ferdinand Pecora led the famous Pecora Commission that after the Great Depression wanted to make sure that we were able to call before the committee none other than people like J.P. Morgan or Sunshine Charlie Mitchell from Citibank. And the purpose was so that they would be able to get to the truth, so they would be able to make sure that as they pursued what had transpired and why the Great Depression took place, that no American was above the law, and that no matter who you are, that you were beholding to the American people. It was the son of Italian immigrants who did not have a high school education, but had the temerity to make sure that in this great country, and when you take an oath in front of the American people and to the Constitution of this country, that there are specific obligations. I commend our colleague for, in that same manner, following that pursuit, and with that, yield to him.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Mr. Chairman, we know that this president has no qualms putting individuals with personal financial conflicts into powerful positions where they can use their government position to personally profit. Shortly after his election, Mr. Trump named investor Carl Icahn as a special advisor to the president on regulatory reform. This was despite Icahn having lobbied the EPA to change the policy around the renewable fuel standard based on a personal financial stake in the market. He subsequently advised the president on cabinet nominees, including the nomination of Scott Pruitt to head the EPA. Icahn's stake in an ethanol refiner stood to benefit, and fluctuations in what is called the RIN, the Renewable Identification Number, following Pruitt's appointment, show his influence paid off. It's also been reported that the Trump administration obtained ethics waivers to lobbyists so they could join agencies they used to lobby, including at least 16 ethics waivers to his own staff. His own staff. Ongoing business ties of his daughter and son-in-law have reaped as much as $200 million from the Trump Hotel in Washington, D.C., even as they sit in offices in the White House advising the president. And just recently, Trump announced the appointment of a for-profit college official accused of fraud to lead the team charged with policing fraud in higher education. So, Mr. Chairman, three things, simple things, and we'll be back. A, 564 financial positions in domestic and foreign companies. B, he's the sole beneficiary of his trust. And C, he has not divested his businesses and was recommended by the Office to do so of Government Ethics. Try that on for size.
Yield back, Mr. Pascrell?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Dr. Davis. You're recognized. Strike the last word.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You know, I'm a firm believer that transparency is an essential ingredient if we are to maintain faith and confidence in our government. I also believe that custom and tradition is one way of making changes or changing law. We've already experienced the custom and tradition. The custom and tradition of every president except President Ford since the 1970s releasing for public information and scrutiny their income tax reforms. We already know that people are suspicious, that there are high levels of cynicism. Unfortunately, more and more people are losing faith and confidence in our government. And if we want to help restore it, then it is important that we provide every bit of information necessary for the public to believe that they have enough information to make decisions. For that reason, I support Mr. Pascrell's resolution and would yield now to him the rest of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Davis. What we're asking for is not extraordinary, Mr. Chairman. In fact, this authority was used by the Ways and Means Committee just 3 years ago in 2014. The committee voted to release confidential taxpayer information of 51 taxpayers. 51. The then chairman, Dave Camp, said this, quote, "This is our oversight function, and this is what the statute provides for." Those are his words. He went on to say this, Mr. Chairman, I find it very interesting. In trying to balance the public's right to know with our responsibilities to protect taxpayer information, this was what was determined to be the best course of action, unquote. And he said this, 6103, that part of the code, provides for this. The statute provides that when the committee in its oversight role finds egregious information, we have the authority to release confidential taxpayer information. Let me repeat, Mr. Chairman, no one on this committee has asked for the release of anything. I simply asked for the examination by this committee to do what their legal responsibilities call for. That's what I've asked for. And whatever happens after that, as in the case in 1924, we go further, that's up to this committee. Speaker Ryan, who was then a member of the committee, himself said that we have a duty. He said this at that time. Quote, "Hold the executive branch accountable because that is the job of the legislative branch." Is he asking for a witch hunt? No. He said releasing this information was about doing our jobs and protecting the Constitution as members of Congress, not as Republicans or Democrats. I agree that this is our duty in providing oversight. By following the committee's release of this private taxpayer information as part of the investigation into the IRS and conservative groups applying for nonprofit status, remember this, many of us have short memories here, there were no criminal charges that came from it. There was only a political advantage for releasing the names of conservative dark money groups like Crossroads GPS. If the committee saw fit to release private information under 6103 for such scant reasons, we have a much more compelling, much more reasonable case, I believe, to use it now to examine known conflicts of interest in the financial dealings of this president.
All time has expired. Ms. Sewell, you're recognized. Strike the last word.
Thank you. I yield my time to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pascrell.
Thank you. In fact, this provision that I referred to was put into the tax code because several members of Congress wanted to examine how Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon wanted to examine who still owned many business interests while serving in the government would benefit from tax legislation then being urged by the Treasury Department. We are now examining the possibility of selling public lands for private profit. This is far more suspect than the infamous Teapot Dome. That was carefully scrutinized. Republicans and Democrats were cutting up the pie, and they paid the price. We can't turn our backs. Even foreign governments have granted trademarks, paid to stay in Trump hotels, leased space at Trump properties. Americans deserve to know if the president is making policy decisions for his own financial benefit. American jobs, national security, and the integrity of us, the Congress. That counts for something, I hope. Just this summer, the District of Columbia in Maryland filed a lawsuit against President Trump, arguing that he is violating anti-corruption clauses in the Constitution by allowing his businesses to accept payments from foreign governments. What the heck happened to Article 1, Section 9? The Constitution requires the President to seek and obtain the consent of Congress before accepting any foreign emoluments. And by failing to do so and seek the consent of the Congress, members of Congress are denied the opportunity to cast a binding vote either granting or withholding their consent. Since all of us always quote the Constitution, let me not be an exception. The denial of that voting opportunity denigrates the institution that we serve and the American people and our integrity pursuant to Article 3 of the Constitution. Previous presidents, like Andrew Jackson, like John F. Kennedy, have complied with the Foreign Emoluments Clause. It has long been understood by Congress and the executive branch that the Foreign Emoluments Clause applies to the acceptance of any benefits or advantage from foreign states, including compensation for services rendered in private capacity. When we're looking at this, are we rummaging through private stuff? Are we going on a fishing expedition? It is incumbent upon the members of this distinguished body, this committee, to ensure that the President of the United States complies with the Constitution. And if I may, Mr. Chairman, which time allows me, these are the forms in case you want to write them down, because I'm holding on to them, but now I want you to go to specific. Let's get more specific. We're going to get more specific every hearing that we have. Trump 1040 and Schedules A, B, D, E, S corporations, K1s, SE, that is self-employment taxes. Form 8938, foreign financial assets. You know how long that is, how big that is? Is he being audited? From 1116, foreign tax credit. Form 8582, which I believe is a passive loss limitation bill code. Form 8865, a controlled foreign partnership. Form 5471, a controlled foreign corporation. Or how about 8621, passive foreign investment company. Form 3520, do you wonder it's 12,000 pages? You may shake your head all you want and dismiss it all you want. How about Form 1045? That's application for a tentative refund from the carryback of net operating losses. How about Form 1040X, amended returns? Any schedules or supplemental information attached to a former schedule?
Mr. Pascal, all time has expired. Ms. Chu, you're recognized.
I move to strike the last word. I believe it's a basic tenet of good government that elected officials are open and transparent about their dealings and their interests. Being elected is a public trust, and even the appearance of impropriety or corruption is damaging, and that rings particularly true for the office of the president. Today, we have a president who takes no issue with breaking 40 years of precedent by refusing to make his tax returns open to the public. This action not only shrouds his business holdings and activity in a cloak of mystery, but it also makes the American people and the world wonder what he could be hiding. Recent reports found that the sale of the largest federally subsidized housing development in the country, located in Brooklyn, New York, will require the approval of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And among those who stand to benefit from that approval of the sale is President Trump. At the same time, last month, the Washington Post revealed that Trump's D.C. hotel is turning in nearly $2 million in record profits in the first 4 months of this year, a time when the Trump Organization initially projected it would lose $2.1 million. And because of this lack of disclosure, we have no idea how much of the hotel's profits come from foreign governments. The full extent of the president's foreign entanglements will continue to be a mystery as he hides his tax returns from the public. Furthermore, as the president continues to tout the need for tax reform and aims to play a key role in the process, disclosure of these returns is critical to clarify how much will benefit the president, his 514 financial positions in domestic and foreign companies, and his self-reported net worth of more than $10 billion. So I join my colleagues in urging this committee to do what's right, and that is to pass this resolution so that the American people can learn whether the president is truly working for them. And I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Pascrell.
Thank you. That was the Trump's individual returns. I called off all the forms that I'm looking at right now. The Trump business returns. Form 1065 is partnership in the LLC filing, is information of 50% partnerships. Form 5472, foreign-owned corporation filings. Form 1120, corporation filing. Form 1120S, S-corporation filings. Form 1041, trust returns, where Trump is trustee or beneficiary. Form 1042, 1042S, withholding on U.S. source income of foreigners. Form W, SBEN, certificate to a withholding agent of the foreign status of a beneficial owner. Forms 8804 and 8805, withholding and effectively connected taxable income allocated to foreign partners. Mr. Trump's related terms, returns of partners and lenders to Trump's businesses, responses to IRS document requests. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk Turkey. I don't have any deep, dark feelings about the president. But my friends, he's a human being like every one of us here. Mr. Chairman, I want to apologize because a little bit under the weather today, but you've got to follow your responsibilities, as you would do. And I can remind you, Mr. Chairman, that before Harvey, there was another hurricane in Texas, 9-10 years before that. I came to Texas, if you remember, Mr. Chairman. I saw Mr. Pope. We're all Americans, as has been mentioned here. And we're all Americans today, Mr. Chairman. So we can have hurricanes, God forbid they don't hurt people. But we can have hurricanes, but this is a political hurricane. And we should prepare for it by doing our duties to our country that we all love. None more than anyone else here. We're all the same. So we need to be treated the same in any kind of an endeavor. Mr. Chairman, I beg of you, as I did on February the 1st and several times since, I beg of you to reach above the script and examine what we can get legally in this committee. I ask you from the bottom of my heart, and I mean it sincerely, although my motivations were questioned today, but
Thank you, Mr.
part of the thing. I'm from New Jersey. I can handle that.
Yes, sir. Well, time has expired, and let me just say you may feel under the weather, but you're not acting under the weather, and we appreciate your efforts. So, are there any amendments?
Mr. Chairman,
Ms. Sanchez, you're recognized.
I move to strike the last word.
Ms. Sanchez recognized. Strike the last word.
Thank you. I give my colleague, Mr. Pasquarello, a lot of credit. He's not feeling 100% today, and yet he is here standing up for his conviction that nobody is above the law. And it takes quite a bit of persistence to continually remind this committee that we have an obligation, that we swore an oath to uphold the Constitution. We have an obligation to make sure that good governance prevails and that our elected leaders are subject to the same treatment as other individuals. And when you look at the history of presidential candidates turning over their income tax returns, it is quite unusual that this president has promised to do that and then reneged on that promise and refuses to continue to do that. It causes one to pause and think, what does he have to hide? And with that, I will yield the balance of my time to Mr. Pasquarello.
Mr. Chairman, my final statement is I want to enter into the record materials that I have been receiving from our Russian friends, who are really friends of this country. And they've been writing, Mr. Chairman, about this and other things dealing with the relationships of our countries, our beloved countries. And I think it might be very important that we read this, because this is what's coming to alert that we will be back again if need be. But I ask everybody on this committee to act with due diligence. Your constituents will be proud of you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Pasquarello. Are there any amendments? If there are no amendments, I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee unfavorably report House Resolution 479 to the House of Representatives.
The question is on reporting House Resolution 479 unfavorably to the House. All those in favor of reporting the resolution unfavorably signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. In the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and House Resolution 479 is ordered unfavorably reported to the House. Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Nunes? Aye. Mr. Nunes, aye. Mr. Teaberry? Aye. Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Roscom? Aye. Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Aye. Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Mr. Reed? Aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Meehan? Mr. Meehan, aye. Ms. Nome? Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding? Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Aye. Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, aye. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert, aye. Ms. Walorski? Ms. Walorski, aye. Mr. Curbelo? Mr. Bishop? Aye. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Neal?
No.
Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Levin?
No.
Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Doggett?
No.
Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson?
No.
Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson?
No.
Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell?
No.
Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley? Mr. Davis?
No.
Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins, no. Ms. Sewell? No. Ms. Sewell, no. Ms. Del Bene?
No.
Ms. Del Bene, no. Ms. Chu?
No.
Ms. Chu, no. Mr. Buchanan? Ms. Black? Mr. Curbelo? Mr. Lewis? Mr. Crowley? Chairman Brady?
Aye.
Chairman Brady, aye.
It's a three-piece sort of day.
Three people voted no.
Gee whiz.
It's a little cool out today when I get up and took my walk in the morning, so I figured.
You're amazing. Pretty classy.
The clerk will report the vote.
21 yeas, 14 nays.
On this vote, the ayes are 21, the noes are 14. The motion is agreed to. House Resolution 479 is ordered unfavorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, I ask staff be authorized to make technical conforming changes to the resolution. The members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental additional dissenting or minority views. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned. Oh, Mr. Lewis, how are you recorded?
No.
Mr. Lewis wishes to be recorded as no, and we will have the roll call vote amended accordingly. Without objection, there being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.